Hi there, it's Ken Fader, your friendly neighborhood archaeologist, talking about a topic that's actually near and dear to my heart. And it's one of those things that has always bothered me, that more Americans don't know about this amazing and remarkable part of our own history. Now, I was first exposed to this, the mound builders of the American Midwest and Southeast, when I was an undergraduate student. And because I was an anthropology major at State University of New York at Stony Brook University, I was given the opportunity to take a graduate course. And I took it with this guy who was like one of the world's experts on the development of state societies. Civilization is a word that people tend not to use so much anymore, but I think it's a perfectly good word if we define it. And then it's societies with complexity, with social stratification, with the wealthy and the poor on the other side, and formal governments and a military presence as well. So in any event, so as an undergraduate, I got to take this course with a world-known anthropologist who focused on the development of civilizations: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Maya. Now, I learned a valuable lesson as an undergraduate, and here's a lesson. I'm going to just send it out there. If you're a student, your professors don't want you to learn this lesson, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. When you are taking a course from somebody who is an expert in something, and your job is to write a term paper about a topic, for goodness sake, don't pick the topic that your prof is an expert in. I mean, it just stands to reason that any mistakes you make, any articles you forget to read, any conclusions you reach, everything, these are things that your professor is going to be invested in and know about and will catch you. So it's always smart. And I did this when I took my graduate course as an undergraduate. Pick something your professor admits he or she knows nothing about. And I did that with Professor Stevenson at Stony Brook. Each of the students had to go in and talk to him about the topic they chose. And most of the students chose very well-known ancient civilizations. And I'm putting them in scare quotes, but I'm not going to anymore. So somebody did a paper on Egypt. Somebody did a paper on the Inca. Somebody did a paper on the Shang dynasties of China. And I sat there with him, and I had just learned about the mound builders in another course, an undergraduate course with the late, great Phil Wigand, who was one of my inspirations at Stony Brook, wonderful archaeologist. And he introduced in his course on North American archaeology the mound building cultures of the American Midwest and Southeast. And I will admit to you that I had never heard of them. Right? I took all the social studies courses in high school, never heard of the mound builders. Sidebar. As a professor at a university, I would always ask my students in all of my classes, before I spoke about the mound builders, all right, raise your hands. How many of you have heard about this in your social studies courses in high school? Crickets. Maybe every once in a while somebody would say, oh yeah, we did talk about this place Cahokia, and I'm going to talk about that in some detail. But by and large, people would come up to me after class and say, why in history did we not hear about this amazing Native American culture, Native American civilization? It's part of American history. So it still is happening. It has not end. It didn't end when I was an undergraduate, when I was in high school. So Phil talked about the mound builders. I became fascinated by it. And when I spoke with Professor Stevenson, I said, I'd like to do the mound builders. And he said, well, Ken, I don't really know much about that. And I thought, score. But he allowed me to, primarily because I was an undergraduate. I wasn't taking this as a graduate student. And I got to tell you, I don't know that the paper was that good, but I did well on it. And I think it was largely because he felt like, well, he didn't know much about the topic. So there's a lesson for you. Choose a topic your professor will allow you to do the paper on, but that doesn't know all that much about. All right. So now, as an undergraduate, I'm able to do that. As a graduate student, completely coincidentally, I am given the opportunity by my graduate department, the University of Connecticut, to go to St. Louis and deliver a paper. I don't even remember what it was about. It's part of a conference. So there was a conference, the Society for American Archaeology meetings in St. Louis, and I went there stoked, because I knew that one of the largest of these mound sites, Cahokia, was on the other side of the Mississippi River from St. Louis, so it's in Collinsville, Illinois, but it's like maybe a 20-minute drive, something like that. So I figured, yeah, I'm going to give my paper, I'm going to make connections with other archaeologists, but I'm going to make sure somehow I'm going to get my butt over to Cahokia, because that's a place I want to see and experience firsthand. So I did. But here's the thing. How am I going to get to Cahokia? Well, I don't have a car, so I'm going to need public transportation. So I go to the front desk. Very nice gentleman at the front desk. And I say, hi, I'm with the archaeology group here. I was wondering, how can I get to Cahokia? I have these conversations with people a lot. He looked at me like I was from another planet. Well, that's another lecture. That's Ancient Aliens. He looked at me like I was from another planet. He said, Cahokia? I've never heard of that, sir. And I thought, well, I must be pronouncing it wrong or something. I said, I say, the big Indian site. He looked at me, he leaned in, shook his head, and I swear he said, oh, sir, there haven't been any Indians around here in years. So he must have thought that me, this kind of befuddled Easterner archaeology type, thought that like right at the margins of St. Louis, the area was full of teepees and buffalo. No. The Indians, it's these large mounds, and the native people had a large city. And he just shook his head like So here's a dude who lives 20 minutes from the biggest, most impressive Native American site in North America, and he's never heard of it. To me, that's like going up to somebody, an adult in London, and saying, ever hear about Stonehenge? Well, yeah, of course they've heard about Stonehenge. Everybody in London knows about Stonehenge. How does everybody in America not know about Cahokia? Drove me crazy, and I'll admit it. I have spent a good portion of my writing career trying to encourage people, to inspire people to visit places like Cahokia. Because look at this. We've got Monk's Mound, named after actually a later monastery, was built on top of it. The thing is so huge. We don't know what the native people called it. It's called Cahokia today. It's in Collinsville in Illinois. Monk's Mound is 100 feet high. It includes 21 million cubic feet of earth, and the footprint is like 15 or 16 acres. If you've ever dug a hole with a shovel or ever put together a pile of dirt, you know the kind of labor that must have involved, the number of people involved. And again, they don't have beasts of burden. They didn't have mechanized devices. They merely had sweat, muscle, sinew, shovels, and baskets. And that's what they produced, probably over a long period of time. This magnificent platform mound. It's a truncated pyramid with multiple steps. And on the top of it, there's evidence of the home of a person who, compared to the other homes that archaeologists find, must have been a person of great import or significance, a chief, or maybe a king. More likely, we can use the word king for the person who lived on top of the mound in Cahokia. So, wow, how do people not know about this? What's the story about the mound builders? What's the mystery, or is there a mystery? It sort of begins in the 18th century after the Revolutionary War. At the end of the war, folks who had served in the war were given the opportunity to move west. Federal government gave them land. If they thought that Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts were getting too crowded, they could get some land in the west. And so the government established this narrow swath of land called the Western Reserve. Now, it's that right there. You won't be able to read that probably, so I've given you a pixelated close-up. It's Connecticut. That was the Western Reserve of Connecticut. So today, I live in Connecticut. It's this little kind of rectangular state with a little peninsula over here on the left and a little cutout in Massachusetts. But back in the day, Connecticut was that. And it was this several 100-mile swath of land that goes from like Pennsylvania through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and west. Now, when those folks left Connecticut proper to get their land in this newly opened up territory, they encountered something they hadn't expected and they didn't understand. and it created in their minds a mystery. And that mystery involved mounds. Now, this is obviously an engraving of a mound in Marietta, Ohio, which is in the eastern part of the state. Now, you'll notice there are tombstones around the mound because the people recognized that that mound in Marietta was a burial, that there were human remains in that mound, and so they decided, hey, this is consecrated ground. We'll put our burials, the European settlers, the Euro-American settlers, we'll put our burials here as well. So, but who built that burial mound? Who were the people in the mound? Where they come from? And this is a large tubulus of earth. It's maybe 30 feet tall, something along those lines. And there's a trench around it. It's this beautiful, like, earth sculpture. Who did that? The answer they came up with again and again was, well, we don't know, but it couldn't be Indians. The conceit was that Native Americans were nomadic, they were hunters, they were primitive, they didn't work hard, and they were incapable of communal effort, the communal effort necessary to build the mounds. That was not universal, but it was a very common perception. So mounds like these, the upper left is the Grave Creek Mound, which I'll talk about again in another lecture, this one about inscriptions found in the mounds. So Grave Creek Mound, that's West Virginia, that's the upper left. Pinson Mound, that's the upper right, that's Tennessee. Lower left is another view of, that's an actual photograph of the mound depicted in the engraving. So that's called Cemetery Mound. And on the lower right is one of the mounds in a place called Mound City, which is, I would have been happier if they had called it Mounds Are Us, but that's just me. So these were all burial mounds. When they dug into the mounds, they found the remains of human beings and objects placed in those mounds. But who are those people? Who built the mounds? Who made the sometimes beautiful artwork found in these burial chambers again and again? Well, we don't know, but it couldn't have been Indians. This is J.D. Baldwin, a science writer, his book Ancient America, published in 1872. It is absurd to suppose a relationship or connection between the original barbarism of these Indians and the civilization of the mound builders. The Indians could have done this. J.W. Foster, Chicago Academy of Sciences. These are big deals, big names, 1887. He, referring to native people in North America, he was never known voluntarily to engage in an enterprise requiring methodical labor. He dwells in temporary and movable habitations. He follows the game in their migrations. To suppose that such a race threw up the strong lines of circumvallation, these are enclosures, I'll give you some pictures of those, and the symmetrical mounds, which crown so many of our river terraces, is as preposterous almost as to suppose that they built the pyramids of Egypt. These guys are saying over and over again, the Indians are a primitive people. They were not capable of these magnificent works of architecture in earth, in soil, or those spectacular, beautiful artifacts, objects that were found inside the mounds. That was supremely common. So here are the arguments, restated in an enumeration. The Indians are too primitive to have built the mounds. So that's a photograph again of Cahokia. The steps leading up to the top are modern. So that's so we tourists can go to the top and get a view from this incredible eminence. It's a floodplain. Everything else is flat except for the mounds. And there are, I believe at its peak, there were 120 mounds at Cahokia. Again, all of this impressive stuff about Cahokia was used to argue that it couldn't have been native people. So again, Indians were too primitive to have built the mounds. Now that was fundamentally based on a mistake, on an error. In the 16th century and 17th century especially, Spanish explorers had traveled through the American Southeast and they eyewitnessed native people, Indians, building mounds and putting the houses of their elites on the tops of the mounds and burying their dead in the mounds. But for whatever reason, the people of the Midwest, people of Ohio, people moving into Ohio, just simply didn't read those accounts. Maybe because they were in Spanish, maybe because the Southeast was just considered an alien place. And so the folks the list of people who were given possible credit for having built the mounds. It was the lost tribes of Israel. It was the Vikings. Maybe it was the Vikings. Maybe the Romans. Maybe it was Chinese. Maybe it was, again, anybody except Native Americans. That was taken as a given. The mounds are way too old to be the product of Native Americans. Here the conceit was, that Columbus got to the New World in 1492. The Indians, the native people, they beat him here, but probably not by very much. So there literally was a belief that, the native people, they got here first, but not that much before Columbus. And so if the mounds can be shown to be very ancient, clearly Native Americans weren't responsible. And scientists, researchers actually did things like count tree rings on mounds to see, if this big tree is growing on the mound, it couldn't have grown on the mound until after it started growing, and it's 237 years old, the mound's got to be at least that old. And this tree is maybe not the first tree that was on the mound, because we have remains of other trees that are older that had obviously died. And so the argument was that the trees growing on the mounds today and the evidence of trees that have grown on the mounds afterwards, those must have grown up on those mounds after the mounds were produced. And it's a long time ago, predates the native people, the Indians. Again, I will devote an entire lecture to inscriptions, but here I'm giving you just examples of a few of these are artifacts that were alleged to be found in mounds, and these are written in some cases, in the case of the Bat Creek Stone and the Newark Holy Stone. You've seen the Holy Stone before if you've watched the episode on archaeological fraud, the Cardiff Giant. Again, I'll focus on them again in the inscriptions lecture. But that's Hebrew. The Bat Creek Stone, maybe that's Hebrew too. Well, if you got Hebrew writing found in a mound, then the people who built the mounds wrote Hebrew. So the people who built the mounds, therefore, must be ancient Israelis, ancient Hebrews, ancient Jews. Indians were not building mounds at the time of their contact with Europeans, which is largely true in Ohio, but not true, as I've mentioned, for Alabama and Georgia and the rest of the Southeast, where people like Hernando de Soto, traveling through that area, sees people building mounds. His Garcilaso de la Vega writes about their encounter with native people building mounds. But that information doesn't make it up to Ohio. This is a 1560 depiction of a burial mound by Jacques Lemoyne, obviously French. This is Garcilaso de la Vega, 1605. Listen to what he writes, talking about the native people. They choose a place where they bring a quantity of earth, which they elevate into a kind of platform. He's describing a platform mound. 2 or 3 pikes high. A pike for him is maybe 25 feet, so 25, 50, 75 feet high. It's a huge mound, the top of which is capable of containing 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 houses to lodge the cacique, that's the ruler, the elite class, with his family and all his retinue. So right here you have a Spaniard describing the building of a mound, describing the use of a mound, and describing a social hierarchy among these people that sounds like ancient Egypt, that sounds like the Shang, that sounds like the Aztecs. But this is North America. These are North American natives, and for the most part, people are rejecting this or ignoring it completely, wanting to believe that the native people were hunter-gatherers and primitive. Metal objects had been found in the mounds, and Indians were a Stone Age people. This was a common canard, a common conclusion reached by folks who wanted to believe that native people were not responsible for the mounds. So you'll read about, we found metal, we found iron in the mound, we found steel in the mounds, we found bronze in the mounds. None of that turns out to be true. All of those turned out to be inaccurate diagnoses, because in each case, almost every single case, they were copper. This is a beautiful set of artifacts. It's copper hands made from cold hammered copper. There are places in the United States, Michigan in particular, where copper can be found in the ground in a pure state. It's not an alloy. It's not an ore. It's absolutely almost 100% pure copper, and by applying a little heat and pounding it, you can make various shapes. And native people in the Midwest made arrow points and spear points, and they made various other artifacts, including works of art, out of that copper. So again, the fact that there was metal found in the mounds absolutely was not evidence that native people had not produced the mounds. What kinds of mounds are there? So let's go back and look at the real archaeological record. Let's look at the data. Let's see the kinds of mounds there are. And there are multiple types. They date to different periods. They're not all the same people making these mounds in the same areas. What does the real deal look like? What do the real mounds actually look like? And there are multiple types, different time periods, different cultural names we assign them. So it's not a single mound builder culture. It's not a single kind of mounds. Let's break it down. So the types of earthworks are burial mounds, mound enclosures, effigy mounds, my favorite, and then the platform mounds or temple mounds. So let's start with the burial mounds. And they are exactly what they sound to be. They are, in fact, the sepulchres, the burial chambers, almost certainly of an elite group in society, of rulers or leaders who were buried in log tombs, sometimes semi-subterranean, and on top of those tombs, a huge accumulation of earth, varying sizes, but some as high as 70 feet high, with circumference of hundreds of feet. And they are buried in the center there. Eventually the logs collapse in on them. There's so much earth that there's not much that you can see on the top that signifies the collapse. But then when these were excavated, they found the remains of humans, of people, with sometimes with lots and lots of grave goods. The assumption being that these were important people, and this was like in Egypt, like in Mesopotamia, like among the Maya, among the Aztecs. The people were being buried with goods that signified their significance, their importance, and their wealth to the society. This actually is a Google Earth shot. It looks weird. What is that? That is a mound in western Ohio called Miamisburg. On the ground, that's what it looks like. It's very impressive. This one is almost 70 feet high. This may be the biggest of the burial mounds. The period we're talking about is maybe 25 or 2,600 years ago up to maybe 1,500 years ago. So it's a rather narrow range. The group names like Adena and Hopewell are names that archaeologists have applied to these cultures based on differences in subsistence and what these people are eating, differences in the raw materials, differences in the mounds themselves. And we're talking about focusing on the American Midwest, Ohio particularly, because I've spent the most time there. And the Miamisburg Mound, very, very impressive. In more like central Ohio is what's called Mound City. Mound City is the traditional name given. It is part of what is now the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. So it's a federally administered park that, in fact, and I'll share this with you later on, has now achieved kind of international status. More about that in a little bit. The main site in the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park is this place that used to be called, and maybe still is called, Mound City. Mound City is a necropolis. You don't usually consider that term relative to Native Americans, but that's exactly what it is. It is a city of the dead. It shows here on a 19th century drawing about 13 acres enclosed by an earth embankment. So that's a lot of work. And then within the embankment, there are 22 burial mounds. So this is a place where a lot of important folks were laid to rest with a lot of important artifacts and materials, again signifying their importance. Most folks weren't buried in mounds. Most folks weren't buried in a necropolis. They were buried in the surrounding area without a lot of dramatic attention paid to them. But these were important people in an important society. These folks, by the way, are not agricultural. They are using nature's bounty, which is pretty substantial in this part of the world, in the rivers and streams, and in the forests and in the plains, the grassy areas, prairies. People are reliant on hunting animals, fishing, collecting shellfish in the rivers, and collecting a lot of wild plants. Agriculture comes in later for the Temple Mound builders, the standard maize, beans, squash, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, served as the focus of their subsistence. But these folks, it's mostly wild crops, and eventually they start cycling in locally domesticated plants. So these are not plants that we ordinarily see at the grocery store, but it's things like marsh elder and pigweed and knotweed and smartweed, foods that are not part of the American diet today, but were very important and were domesticated by the native folks, who at the same time had this very active and impressive ceremonial life in terms of disposing of their dead. Now, this is a little computer graphic of what it looks like if you were in a drone, I guess, flying over it. The tan spots in the foreground are the borrow pits. This is where they got the soil, or some of it anyway, to build the mounds, to build the individual burials that we see inside the enclosure. This is what it looks like from kind of the back deck of the museum. There's a beautiful, very nice museum there with artifacts that were recovered in these mounds. So in the foreground, on this side of the tree, you're looking at the embankment. It's not for protection. It's not military. It's completely ceremonial. It's about 3 or 4 feet tall, and there's an entryway right there where you walk into the enclosure. And in this photo, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. There's like 4 mounds out of the 22. Some larger than others. There's one oval mound in the enclosure that has multiple burials. The arrow is pointing to the embankment, and then the other arrows are pointing to a series of the burial mounds in here. Again, this clearly was a special place, a sacred place, where the dead were laid to rest. And again, based on our understanding of these cultures, these were people of higher status, economic, social, political status. The mound in the center there is a big oval one that has multiple burials. The ones to the right and left are smaller, round, conical mounds. There are thousands and probably tens of thousands of similar mounds individually throughout the American Midwest, Southeast. This is a almost unique concentration of these mounds. Now again, we're talking about a culture. These are not nomadic folks. These are not folks who are unsophisticated technologically or socially. I mean, these are folks who they belie the stereotype that too many people had back then, and that too many people continue to have about traditional Native American culture. These are sophisticated folks with sophisticated art, sophisticated architecture, sophisticated astronomy, as we'll see in just a little bit. This is that same, you're looking to the right of the slide is the inside of the necropolis. There's that tree is actually growing out of the embankment that separates the sacred space inside from the profane or the vernacular or ordinary space outside. Mound enclosures are one element of the mound building that people don't expect. And essentially what we're looking at are high bluffs in which the native people built embankments around the edges of the bluff. Now, there's no evidence of occupation inside. You don't find debris from kitchen debris or garbage or people making tools. They tend to be clean places. And that indicates in all likelihood that they're sacred places, that for whatever reason, folks are demarcating the tops of these bluffs with earth embankments and separating that space from the mundane space down below where they're living and collecting food, where they're burying their dead, and so on. These enclosures sometimes cover vast spaces. Again, it's not for protection. You can easily walk over one of these mounds. There are entryways all throughout. It clearly is a ceremonial separation of space. It's called Fort Ancient, and this is what it looks like. Again, it's a computer graphic where those yellow things are mounds, and some of them are 10, 12 or more feet high. Some of them are quite a bit less, and there are segments of it. It's a segmented enclosure, and it's a large area. And again, it's not for settlement. It's not for separating those people from enemies. It seems to be purely based on ceremonialism. Hard to get a good picture of Fort Ancient from the ground because, I mean, you're just looking at this vast area and there are mounds in the distance. And so that's what you're looking at there. The Newark earthworks are in Ohio, absolutely spectacular because you have these beautifully symmetrical enclosures that is areas, space enclosed by earthen embankments, but you also have what effectively is an avenue leading from one set of these enclosures to another, and that's over a mile long, and the embankments there are, again, several feet high. So it looks like these are ceremonial avenues or ceremonial pathways that have been flattened, been cleared, and mounds demarcating their edges have been placed on either side. If you look at the bottom of the slide, that's called the Great Circle. And the Great Circle is an enormous enclosure. It includes about 30 acres, and the mound itself is about, I think it's about a dozen feet high. I've been there, and so I'm thinking it's over my head for sure. And this is outside of the enclosure. So again, hard to get a photograph of on the ground, but you see there is an entryway right in front. When I get to the entryway and I turn to the right, that you can see that circle as it is arcing around off in the distance. So that's about 12 feet high. And today there actually is a path that leads along the top of that because it's almost a mile. And I have been there and seen folks jogging along that to get a little bit of exercise. This is an enormous piece of work. I mean, imagine enclosing 30 acres. And again, no beasts of burden, no machines, no mechanized way of doing this, but essentially it's sweat. It's blood, sweat, and tears, shovels, baskets. Obviously, the folks who did this thought it was an important thing, an important task to separate, again, probably, and demarcate sacred space on the inside where ceremonies may have been employed. We can't know for sure, but then it demarcates that space from the space around it, the space outside. So sacred, vernacular, or ordinary. The arrow points to this combination of enclosures, a circular enclosure, and what appears really to be kind of a large octagonal enclosure. And it's hugely impressive. 50 acres in the octagon, and it's about 20 acres in the circle, with those mounds connecting the two. I mean, this is effectively a sculpture in earth. Different from the kinds of things we ordinarily consider art, but to me, this is art. And again, it's a demarcation of sacred space. Those rectangles in the 50-acre octagon are, in fact, mounds. They're not burial mounds, but they are merely mounds that have been added to that sacred space for reasons that we really, at this point, can't explain. We don't know. Now, what's really inexplicable is that the state of Ohio, years ago, deeded this sacred place to a country club. And it's a golf course. Yep, it's a golf course inside a Native American sacred enclosure. And those white things you're seeing there, those are sand traps. It's a 9-hole golf course. Now, this has become a great point of contention. The Native folks are not happy with a bunch of golfers traipsing over their sacred space on a regular basis. And to add to that, the country club keeps non-players away, and understandably so. They don't want people walking around while golf balls are whizzing over their head. There currently is a court case in which the desire of the state is to retain title to the country club, to the enclosure, and to close down the country club ultimately, and to make this again a site where people can go and experience, where Native people can go and experience the sacred place for themselves, and where non-natives can come and gain an appreciation for the Native people of Ohio. Yep, that's the Mound Builders Country Club. I've got photographs of when I was there. You're really not supposed to walk out onto the country club, and that's understandable. There are a few days a year that are non-golf days when people are invited to come by. There is a platform that's built outside of the enclosure, so you can get a little bit better idea of it. But clearly that is not a very satisfying approach, and that ultimately the goal is to have the country club vacate to no longer be a golf course, to fill in the sand traps, and let it be what it once was, which is a sacred enclosure built by native people. I'm standing on one of the mounds. Probably I wasn't supposed to be there, but you're not going to tell anybody, right? And I'm looking from the octagon into the circle, various perspectives of this earthwork, and you can see all the golf tees. There's an artifact right there in the middle of the slide, but it's not a native artifact. It's a golfing artifact. It's a golf bag. Outside of the main enclosure is another little circular enclosure, and even there's a golf hole in the middle there. It's that little flag demarcating it. And listen, I understand that most of the folks watching these will probably not be native people, but now put yourself in the position of native people. I mean, would you be happy if somebody put a golf course in a colonial, like a mini golf course in a colonial graveyard, using the stones as, as hazards? Probably not. And I think many native people feel the same way, that its use for sport by mainly non-native people is inappropriate and unacceptable. Again, the courts will work this out, hopefully, in the next couple of years. This is one of the large mounds inside. This is outside of the circle, and you're looking at the mound that stands at the very bottom of it, the bottom of that circle. What's really interesting is if you were to stand on top of that mound and look through the connection between the circle and the octagon, on one day every 18.6 years, the moon rises right in that line. And that 18.6 year cycle is actually a very important astronomical cycle in the position of the moon, which has a maximum north and south rise each month and each year. And over 18.6 years, it rises a maximum north and a maximum south. And this probably, it is not a coincidence that this site is aligned with that. So we have an astronomical alignment here in North America that is similar to the alignments we see in the megaliths of Western Europe, where the alignments are primarily solar, aligned with the sun. Here is an alignment with the location of the moon over a long period of time. When you're looking at an 18.6 year period, you're also looking at folks who are there for a long time, who are taking those measurements and taking those sightings over and over again, over an extended period of time, and passing those down to the next generation, and then building the mounds, building the enclosure in alignment with that. It's very impressive. Effigy mounds are probably everybody's favorite because they are actual earth mounds in the shape of animals. And perhaps the most famous is the mound called Serpent Mound. This is a 19th century engraving of it. It's so cool. It is a giant snake with a coiled tail. One interpretation is that the mouth is open and it's about to swallow something, but it's unclear. This is in, again, Ohio, more or less southern central Ohio, and it's called the Great Serpent. From the tip of that tail, you follow the coiled tail all the way down to the face, the mouth of the open snake. It's about 1,350 feet. It is monumentally scaled. Here is a artist's conception of the snake. And this is what the site looks like today. They've got a fire tower. You can walk up to the top and you can look down the body of the snake and you can see the coils going down the hill. You're on top of a bluff, and some of those enclosures are on bluffs, and they've had their edges demarcated with mounds. Here, instead of doing that, they placed this tremendous effigy of a snake. So this is what it looks like from on top. If you go to Serpent Mound, it looks a little sketchy. The fire tower, don't be afraid of it. Don't be concerned. Climb up to the top, because that's the only way you get a really good impression of the thing as a whole. And the state has placed pathways on either side of the snake, but you really, again, from the bottom, it's impressive, but you really can't see the thing in its entirety. Here's the tail, the tip of that tail, and there's the head, the face, not exactly sure what. And there are a number of these effigy mounds. There's an entire national monument in Iowa called, in fact, Effigy Mound National Monument, that has birds and bears are the primary effigy mounds there. They're not as big as as Serpent Mound, but they're really, again, also impressive. Hard to see from the ground, but still, the fact that native people, maybe 1,000 years ago, went to a lot of trouble to build these mounds and to shape them. These were sculptures. They're sculptures in earth. Platform mounds are among the most recent, and these represent what are called truncated pyramids. They're pyramids of earth, but the top is gone. There's no top. There's no pointy top. There's a big flat surface. These are the kinds of things that Garcilaso de la Vega in the 16th and 17th century spoke about, seeing native people actually building these things, native people actually putting the houses of their elites on the tops of these things. Just to show you again how widespread the mound building phenomenon in its many incarnations was in the Native America, Midwest and Southeast especially. Town Creek Mound, North Carolina, which appears to be a major population center, or at least a ceremonial center. That's a reconstruction of the building that was on top of the main mound there. You can see off in the distance, there's a palisade. There's a walled, the entire site is enclosed in a palisade, a wall made of small logs or saplings. And that's pretty typical at these sites. In some cases, the building of the wall was probably a larger project than the building of some of the mounds. This is Moundville in Alabama. They come up with great names, don't they? There's Mound City, there's We gotta work on better names anyway. But Moundville, Alabama, and this is a very large site. Again, later period, sometimes called the Mississippian, sometimes called just the Temple Mound builders. But here we've got several very large mounds, large in terms of their footprint, but also large in terms of their height, 50 and 60 feet high. And again, this likely was a population and ceremonial center. So you've got, consider these as sort of minor capitals of a nation of people who, for the most part, are living in the countryside, who are planting crops in small villages. But this is their capital. This is their center. This is where their rulers live. This is where their religious leaders live. And they are different. They have a higher status in the society, and they make sure that the society runs smoothly. And this is me there, actually on one of the larger mounds, looking out into what was a plaza. This notion of that these sites were filled with open spaces where various ceremonies and activities took place. And this open space has mounds, has these earthen mounds sort of demarcating it. We do know in some of these sites that a game was played with a stone and a stick. It's kind of a combination of soccer and hockey, and it was a very important ceremonially, but also, I'm sure, an important part of coming and visiting these main sites and watching these games, this game with the chunky stones, watching these games proceed, was part of what it meant to be a citizen of these societies. Etowah in Georgia, again, throughout the Southeast, big temple mounds. I'm standing on the largest of the mounds, looking down on this beautifully maintained mound. The stairs are modern. The stairs leading up to the top were put there in order for visitors to come and look at the top and sort of get a feeling for what it would have been like to be one of the elite members of the society, because you had your house up on the top of that mound. And there were, in fact, ways of getting to the top with rampways originally. This is the largest mound there in Etowah. It's enormous. And again, there is a palisade. There is a wall, a log wall that surrounds the main part of this site where the elite have their houses. Cahokia is the best example of that. This is an artist's conception of Cahokia. It's not an incredibly dense city. You look at this and you don't think New York, and you don't think London, and you don't think Paris, or you don't think Mexico City, you don't think Tokyo, but you consider the fact that over the extent of the area around the central part of Cahokia, there probably were a minimum of 10,000 people. 20,000, 30,000 is not out of the question. In the old world, the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, mentioned in the Bible, Ur and Uruk, have a population of around 10,000. So when you're looking at a Native American community with 10,000 people in a relatively tight space, that says city to at least many archaeologists and many anthropologists and many historians. So I started by showing a picture of Monk's Mound. There's Monk's Mound at the large mound, the large platform towards the top and right of the slide. Now that area, that sacred precinct with other very tall mounds, is enclosed in a log wall that was rebuilt several times that includes literally tens of thousands of logs. So this is a huge project, a huge undertaking. And what was the purpose of it? Well, maybe it was to keep the elite safe from the people in their own city. It was a walled compound. It was a sacred city, a sacred compound. And but the amount of labor, the amount of work that it took to create this safe haven was absolutely enormous. And we see at this place, at Cahokia, there probably were at least 120 mounds. I think 80 of them still have survived after years of agriculture and construction. This is an aerial shot, that mine, of Monk's Mound. You can see it has, of course, eroded. It has changed shape, but it must have been absolutely magnificent. The grass the vegetation had to be cut down. In some of these mounds, there's evidence of a clay cap put over the soil so that at least to keep vegetation at a minimum. So these were impressive places. These were large places. These were places where they were set. Cahokia was a central place. It's a place where raw materials poured in from all across the Midwest and all across the northern plains and all across the southeast. Raw materials filtered in, and the specialists, the laborers, the artists of Cahokia converted those raw materials into beautiful objects, and I'll show you some of them in a little bit, that they then redistributed to the secondary and tertiary cities or villages that all owed their allegiance to Cahokia. It is my impression that between the years 1150 and maybe 1400, the Common Era or AD, that anybody living in the American Midwest knew about Cahokia. Many of them had been there, and they all viewed Cahokia as their central place. If you want to use the word capital, I think that's fair. The capital of a loosely affiliated organization, political organization of folks who all knew that ultimately Cahokia was the center. They have a beautiful museum in Cahokia, state of the art, and you're looking at an exhibit that shows the relative sizes of world pyramids. So on the left, that's the Pyramid of the Sun or Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan. So this is pre-Aztec, outside of Mexico City, the spectacular pyramid built by the people who preceded the Aztecs. On the far right is an Egyptian pyramid. It's one of the pyramids at Giza. Huge undertaking. The burial chamber of a pharaoh is located in that. If you look, the black image, the lower right, that's the large pyramid at the site of Etowah that I showed you before. Monk's Mound is the big black square right smack in the middle of that exhibit. Now, it's not tall. It's about 100 feet tall, but it covers an enormous footprint. In fact, if you go by volume, Monk's Mound is, I think, the fifth largest pyramid in the world. Include all the pyramids, whatever they're built out of, however tall they are. But in terms of volume, the Monk's Mound pyramid ranks up there with some of the largest pyramids on Earth, wherever they're found. Now, this is actually not from Cahokia, but it's an artist's conception of what it would have been like to build a mound. So you got a bunch of folks carrying basket loads of dirt. If you've carried a basket load of dirt, you know how heavy that can be, and slowly but surely providing this tall platform on top of which your ruler will probably be living. Now, this is a photograph of Cahokia. This is maybe from the first time I visited. You notice there's a brick house there. The state has really taken the place over and has improved it tremendously. They've removed the roads and sidewalks that don't belong in the middle of a 600 or 700 year old Native American city, and so now it really highlights the mounds themselves. And the stairway leading up to the top of the Cahokia mound is modern. When I was there, it was kind of falling apart, so they have fixed it up considerably. Now, this is, again, in the museum, an artist's conception of what that mound would have looked like, with fence work and a major structure, the ruler of Cahokia, the great king of Cahokia, being able to look out on the multitudes, his people or her people, and rule from on high. You can walk up to the top, which is worthwhile. From the top of Monk's Mound now, I am looking into a big open spot, an open area. It's a plaza. And to the left, you see that arrow pointing to a large platform mound, and to the right, a large circular or conical mound. Those mounds at any other site would be the big deal, would be the biggest structures. At Cahokia, they're secondary, because Monk's Mound is far, far larger. Oh, these are close-ups of the flat top mound and the conical mound, but from the top of Cahokia, if you look to the west, that's what you see. Now, it's a telephoto lens, so it's closer. It's not as close as it looks. There's in the middle of St. Louis, there's that half of McDonald's they never completed. I don't know if they're ever going to complete that, but yeah, you know, I'm snarky, so what can I say? But that's downtown St. Louis. It's a lovely city, and it is, again, about a 20-minute drive to Cahokia. So everybody in St. Louis now hopefully knows about Cahokia. The museum, spectacular state-of-the-art museum, wasn't there when I was there in the 1970s, but it's been built more recently. Now, there's this little mound, not particularly impressive on the ground, that was excavated, and it turns out to be hugely impressive. It's the burial mound. It's a burial mound, and it includes the burial of a person who almost certainly was one of the rulers or leaders or important ceremonial or religious individuals at Cahokia. That's the one. The person in blue is a young man, and he's buried on a cape of thousands and thousands of shells that all came from the Gulf of Mexico. So these had to be collected, they had to be drilled, they had to be carved, and they had to be brought north to Cahokia, a few hundred miles. You'll notice that there are lots and lots of what look like little icons of humans, and that's the case. This is Mound 72 at Cahokia, which includes not just that ruler and a woman as well, a female, who also seems to be of incredible importance to the people of Cahokia. But there are lots and lots of other folks, many of whom show evidence of having been sacrificed to accompany their great ruler, we assume at the same time, to the afterlife. So, for example, right in the center, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of people all lined up together. Everyone in there is a female, and everyone is between the ages of like 16 and 24, based on analysis of their skeletons. They were all sacrificed. You think about human sacrifice, you think about the Egyptians, they sacrificed their retainers so they can accompany the pharaoh to the afterlife. You hear about the Shang dynasty in China, the oldest civilization in China, where again there's clear evidence of human sacrifice. When the ruler dies, the ruler needs retainers, needs servants, needs help for the afterlife. It looks like Cahokia had a similar practice, and that's a society in which somebody is of such great importance that other people are killed in order to accompany them to some afterlife. That's a sign of a very complex society where people may actually believe that that's the right thing because that's the way the gods, the spirits want it. So Mound 72 is absolutely spectacular. It is so incredible, it's still being analyzed. It was discovered years ago, still being analyzed for its significance and meaning. This is a wax figure showing the head guy at Cahokia, the person in the primary burial, and you see the thousands and thousands of perforated shells. He's also buried with 1,000 beautifully made spear points. He's buried with shell from the Gulf Coast. He's buried with copper, buried with mica, buried with a whole host of materials. This is a mere sample. The two black, shiny ones in the upper right, that's obsidian. There's no obsidian. It's volcanic glass. There's no obsidian in St. Louis. Nearest source, you're looking at Wyoming, Idaho. So the trade networks must have been vast. This is, again, from that museum showing the ripples around Cahokia. Cahokia was a central place, what geographers call a central place. The way New York City is a central place. The way Mexico City is a central place. Different scale, for sure, but nevertheless the same idea, that these folks living in these ripples outside of Cahokia are all connected to Cahokia through trade, through warfare, through visitation, through pilgrimages, and so on. It's an impressive place. Now, just the last set of slides is just to show you the incredible quality of the art produced by these folks. Mica, which is a mineral, it's really cool. It looks like paper almost, so that these flat bands all kind of cemented together. It's a relatively light material and relatively soft, and native people, where they could find good sources of mica, in the American Southeast especially, they used stone tools to cut them into shape. And here we see it's a beautiful style of art, isn't it? A hand and a couple of humans, and those human beings are missing their heads and missing their arms. So these may be representations of sacrifice victims. More examples of the cut mica, which is an incredible raw material. On the left is a human without feet or hands or a head, and the one on the right is the plumage of a bird. Showed you this before. These are copper hand cutouts. This is absolutely stunning, isn't it? It is a bird, peregrine falcon, maybe? And it's made out of a copper sheet that's been cut with stone tools, and then using probably other copper punches, some of the design elements were carved into that. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful work of art. One of the really cool artifacts found in some of the mound builder sites, and again, I'm showing you a whole melange, a whole host of stuff, not all from the same group of mound builders, but just to give you an idea of the incredible beauty and the craft exhibited by these folks. These are pipes, smoking pipes. Now, native tobacco was smoked by folks here in the Midwest and Southeast, and it's part of a ceremonial, based on ethnohistorical information, based on what was described by Europeans who came into this area early on in the 17th century, even the 16th century, that this was a ceremonial act, that is, smoking the tobacco. Plus, the native tobacco has a real high nicotine content, and probably also was, to some extent, hallucinogen may be too strong a word, but it certainly kind of changed your outlook. And imagine the bowls, the area where you put the tobacco, are the backs of these animals. And we have a peregrine falcon and a frog and a wildcat and a raven and a rabbit. So the bowl is on the backs, and there's a hole drilled through there, and then a hole drilled through the platform, and that's where you draw the smoke out by putting your lips around the edge of that platform. And so that animal, that spirit animal, is looking you right in the eyes. Too close to even focus on, but you can imagine the experience of smoking this sacred tobacco and looking into the eyes of this sacred spirit animal while your mind is starting to experience the effects of this very heavy dose of nicotine. And these are, again, these pipes are absolute works of art. It's about the right size if you're looking at a regular size screen. This is the state artifact of Ohio. It is, I think, the most beautifully carved of the effigy pipes. It's a person, obviously. The draw hole is on his head, in that little cap on his head, and the tobacco is placed between his feet. What's really cool about this is it also is a representation of what a person may have looked like. So this guy's wearing a loincloth, he's got a helmet on, and those around his ears, those are huge earplugs, ear spools, gauges. So when you see somebody with a bunch of gauges today, people in Ohio were doing that 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or more. And it's absolutely, it's a work of craft that you just blows my mind. I love this. This is a carved plaque that has two snakes figures who are facing one another but upside down from one another. It's a beautiful piece of work. Carving of a human face. Again, there are two artifacts being shown here. This is Cahokia. The one on the left shows two very Mesoamerican looking carvings of faces. Whether or not the people of the American Southeast had direct contact with the Maya or the people who preceded the Aztecs, it's a controversial point, but some of the similarities are, and certainly they're planting corn and beans and squash, and at least the corn and beans came from Mesoamerica. So are they sending emissaries there? Unknown. Are they indirectly in contact with them? Again, unknown. But some of the similarities are pretty striking. The second carving from the left is the Birdman. You see the Birdman everywhere. It's a human being who appears to be dressed as a bird. And the one on the right is the back side of the Birdman plaque. And some of these effigy bowls, this is just, kind of a delightful piece of art. It is a bowl with the face of a beaver. So that's the handle. And he's got his big beaver teeth and he's holding on. Again, these were not made on a wheel. These are made by hand. So they are beautiful works of ceramic art. Here is obviously a mother. This is Cahokia again, a mother nursing her baby. This is one of the, I think, the most spectacular, beautiful of these works of art for the mound builders. It is a guy, a person, with a bear outfit. So it looks like he's wearing the head of a bear. And look, he's got these big ear spools, and he's holding the disembodied head of, is it a sacrifice victim? Is it a war victim? Can't tell. But his hair is going down. Gravity is pulling the hair down of the guy who's only got a head, and he's wearing an ear spool. So that same theme in art is showing up here. Just love that. And now I want to close with this. A number of the sites in Ohio that I've shown you here are now part of an accumulation of sites that have been recognized by the World Heritage Organization. So there's an organization run by the United Nations that has a list, the World Heritage List, that puts places that are of international significance, importance, worthy of consideration, worthy of protection. So there are places like the Grand Canyon is on this list. The Taj Mahal is on this list. The pyramids in Egypt on that list. The Great Wall of China is on that list. Cahokia is on that list. A couple of sites in the American West. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon is on that list. Poverty Point in Louisiana is on that list. And now the latest addition for America is the Hopewell culture. So the Mound City, the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, and a number of other sites around it are now part of that World Heritage List. So they've gotten international recognition, which is, I know some of the people involved in the hard work of getting it nominated and getting it accepted. I couldn't be happier for them. Look, the thing I like to end with here is that these places are part of Native American heritage and history. It belongs to them, this history. It's their history. But as Americans, even those of us who are not Native, I think it's a great idea for us to recognize all of, in an inclusive way, American history. And this is part of American history. And so I encourage people. There are so many of the sites I've mentioned are open to the public. They're national monuments or state parks. And they encourage you, and I encourage you, go and visit these places for yourself and see for yourself, engage personally in the remarkable histories of the Native American people. And is there a book for that? Well, yeah, there just happens to be. And I will give links to that book at the end of this presentation. Yeah, it's my book. Shamelessly flogging my own book again. But it's a practical guide for you to go out there and search for these places, find these places, go to the museums, walk around the mounds, see the artifacts, and understand that there's this missing part of American history, this part that you don't get told often enough in high school or in your history classes, even as an undergraduate. And it's an important part of American history, and I think we all benefit from inclusion. We all benefit from making our histories more inclusive and more complete and more thorough. And so if I've encouraged you or inspired any of you out there to go and see some of these places for yourself, I'm a happy guy. I've done my job. So thank you very much.